Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Good morning, everyone. Namaste. Today I'm going to interact with you on the topic Epic as a Form in Paradise Lost. This is a part of the paper History of English Literature. If I ask you, what is an epic? Do you know? What is it? It's a particular type of genre. What are its features? What is its structure? What are the kind of themes which are included under epics? What are the subjects which are taken up? And we are also going to talk about examples in literature from ancient Indian and Western literature. And finally, we'll also talk about the Paradise Lost as an epic. So this word epic has been taken from Greek terminology. It's a word for a poem or a story. It's a genre of narrative, a long story told in poetry about great civilizations, about history. The theme, the tone, and the style of an epic is always elevated and dignified. An epic celebrates heroic deeds and historically important events. And the protagonist of an epic is generally a hero or a legendary figure of the past history of a nation. And he undergoes a number of challenges through. And the form and the style of the narrative poem must also be grand, dignified. And I am using a term which has been used by Garnett, a critic, Garnett. He says the theme should be perspicuous and sublime. Perspicuous. Perspicous. So that such kind of style, it does justice to the character. Subject should be grand. Style should be formal. Hero should be exalted. Narrative should be in third person. And it should be lengthy. It must teach moral and philosophical lessons. And when we talk of epic tradition, invocation to muse in the beginning, that is also there in that tradition. So coming to the epics in the Indian literature, do you know any of the names? Is Ramayana an epic? Yes. When we talk of the oldest examples from Indian literature, Bharatiya literature, Ramayana by Maharishi Valmiki and Mahabharata by Sri Vedvyas, they are the oldest epics in the world. And when it comes to Mahabharata, it's the longest poem composed at any point of time in any part of the world. It consists of 18 parvas with 1 lakh shlokas, that is 2 lakh verse lines, as each shlok is a couplet, and it's written in Sanskrit. And Mahabharata has given us the world famous maxims like Karmanyeva adhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. Phal ki ichha mat karo. And about soul, it has given us that soul never dies. It's the body which dies. And when it comes to Western literature, So there are epics like Epic of Gilgamesh. Then the Greek poet Homer has written epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Then the Roman poet Ovid, he has written Metamorphoses, which consists of 15 books. And in when we talk of Europe, so another name which comes to mind is Dante, who has written Divine Comedy. So what is an epic? And if I quote Aristotle has propounded that there are 4 constituent parts of an epic. Number 1, plot. Number 2, character. Number 3, thought. And number 4, action. And he has talked about each 4 of them in detail in the Poetics. About plot, Aristotle says that plot of an epic should be dramatically constructed. It should center upon a single action, which is whole and complete. And he makes a distinction between history and epic. In history also, incidences from history are recorded, but the aim of history is to focus on single period, while that of an epic is single action. That is the difference. All the elements of an epic poem are found in tragedy. This is what, again, Aristotle makes a difference between an epic and a tragedy. Both of them must have exalted themes, grand themes, but all the elements of a tragedy are not found in an epic poem. And when we analyze Milton as a writer of an epic, Paradise Lost, so we come to know that at an early age of 16, Milton aspired to write the great English epic. As he read the classical epics in school, which I just mentioned, Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, Virgil's Aeneid, so he began to fantasize about bringing such artistic brilliance to the English language. Milton considered many topics for his epic. Early on, he thought that the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, it was a good topic, noble topic, and he will write on that. Then, as he grew slightly older, he hoped to write an epic about Oliver Cromwell, who took control of England in 1653 after helping to dethrone and execute King Charles I. So, judging from these 2 topics, it is clear that Milton wanted to write his epic on a distinctly British topic that would inspire nationalist pride in his countrymen. Such a topic would also mimic Homer's and Virgil's nationalist epics of strong and virtuous warriors and noble battles. However, Milton abandoned both of these ideas and for a time gave up the notion of writing an epic at all. But again, in the mid-1650s, Milton returned to this idea, the idea which he had previously had for a verse play, the story of Adam and Eve. He concluded that the story might fail as a drama but succeed as an epic. You know that in 1652, Milton had lost his eyesight. In 1656, the blind Milton, he began to recite verses each morning to one of his two daughters, who wrote his poem down for him. Milton continued to dictate Paradise Lost for several years, and eventually he finished it in 1667 when it was first published in 10 books. Soon he returned to revise the topic. Revise not just the topic, rather the entire epic. The topic remained rather the same. So he redivided the book into 12 books, as classical epics were divided. And he published an authoritative second edition form in 1671. And you know that he died in 1674. 3 years before that, he published the revised version. And he also wrote his final work, Paradise Regained, which was a sequel to his great epic Paradise Lost. Due to his strong religious beliefs, Milton thought that this work, Paradise Regained, it would surpass Paradise Lost in both its art and its message. But you know that just like me and other readers, they would disagree with Milton. Now, coming to the epic features, which can be seen prominently in the Paradise Lost. So we go to the beginning, which is the prologue of the book 1. You can find it in abundance. When it comes to the lofty theme, yes, Milton's speaker begins Paradise Lost by stating that his subject will be Adam and Eve's disobedience and fall from grace, fall from heaven. And then Milton invokes a heavenly muse and asks for help in relating his ambitious story and God's plan for humankind. So that big, that grand is the theme. And Paradise Lost, which is written in blank verse, Milton begins it in the traditional epic manner. Yes, as I said, by invoking the muse. And that muse also is Urania, Urania, the muse of astronomy. And Milton calls her the heavenly muse. But this muse is more than just the classical Urania. It's a kind of Christian muse who resides on Mount Sinai, Sinai. And in fact, it's a kind of Holy Spirit. And in the first lines of the first book of Paradise Lost, Milton thus draws on two traditions, not just the first book, I mean even in the prologue itself. He draws on two traditions. One is the classical epic exemplified by Homer and Virgil, and second is the Christian tradition embodied in the Bible, as well as you can say in works like Divine Comedy. Another epic tradition is the epic style, which is known as medias res, medias, medias res, which is beginning in the middle. And if you look at the action, the way it takes place in the Paradise Lost, it begins from the beginning. Does it begin from the beginning? No, it begins from the middle. And then it proceeds on to the beginning. And when it comes to main theme, it has been proposed at the beginning. That is, man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. This is the subject of the entire poem, which has been given in the beginning of the book itself. Man's disobedience, this is the theme, and the loss thereupon of paradise. So that place which was theirs. And what is the cause of the fall? The Saturn. Who is Satan? Who is a fallen angel. He used to live in the company of God himself. But he revolted against God and he was thrown out of heaven. So this is the theme. This is the subject. And when it comes to making the structure of Paradise Lost, Milton is again inspired by Virgil. And I'm quoting, he had chosen to write an eternal epic on a sacred theme, not an epic focusing on older imperialistic themes like the Aeneid, or a nationalistic poem celebrating a prominent leader. And I quote Dr. Johnson when he talks about the subject of Paradise Lost as very, very sublime. He says, quote, "The subject of Milton is not the destruction of a city, the conduct of a colony, of the foundation of an empire. His subject is the fate of the worlds, the revolutions of heaven and earth, rebellion against the supreme king, raised by the highest order of created beings, the overthrow of their host and the punishment of their crime, the creation of a new race of reasonable creatures, their original happiness and innocence, their forfeiture of immortality, and their restoration to hope and peace." And the Bible had supplied him with this theme. But when we talk of Milton's work, Paradise Lost, as an epic, it also differs significantly from the epic tradition of Greco-Roman antiquity or the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Earlier epics developed ideas of heroism that celebrates martial valor, intense passions such as wrath or revenge, and cunning resourcefulness. If indeed such traits of epic heroism are retained by Milton, they tend to be embodied in Satan and not in God. In other words, Milton uses the epic form simultaneously as a critique of an earlier tradition of heroism and as a means of advancing a new idea of Christian heroism, for which the crucial virtues are faith, patience, and fortitude. Undoubtedly, this idea of heroism was influenced by Milton's personal experience with adversity and by his public service as a polemicist and an opponent of Stuart absolutism and the episcopacy of the Church of England. Under attack from his adversities, Milton was the advocate of something you can say a righteous. So he was fighting for a righteous cause that had failed. The triumph of his adversities, then Milton's solitude after the Restoration, his struggle to understand how and why, under the sufferance of providence, evil seemingly prevailed, and other questions which came to his mind, like the ones, why the evil people were succeeding in life, whereas virtuous and righteous people like him were failing. And also, as I said, that he had a plan to write a British epic on Arthur. At the same time, however, one may acknowledge that some traditional traits of epic heroism are embodied in characters such as the sun with S capital. Surely, wrath and martial effectiveness are manifested in the war in heaven. But Milton more emphatically affirms that the greater triumph of the sun is his voluntary humiliation on behalf of humankind. Accordingly, faith, patience, and fortitude are the crucial virtues to be exercised by the Son in his redemptive ministry, which he has agreed to undertake because of meekness, filial obedience, and boundless love for humanity. Heroism is simply one of a series of epic conventions used but adopted by Milton. Another, as I said, is the invocation of the Muse, who is not precisely identified whether it's the Holy Spirit or more generally the Spirit of the Godhead. At times, Milton alludes to the classical muse of epic poetry, Urania. The intent, however, is to identify her not as the source of inspiration, but as a symbol, or you can say an imperfect type of the Hebraic and Christian muse through which the divine word was communicated to the prophets or embodied in Jesus for dissemination to humankind. And if you look at the third convention, which is intrusion by supernatural beings, that is a convention in epics. So you see that action takes place throughout the epic. There is a form of struggle. Humankind's experience of temptation after Satan conceals his malice behind external friendliness and solicitude. And finally, when we talk of the convention of Paradise Lost, including the extended similes and catalogues, this convention of an epic is also followed there. For instance, in book 1, Satan, who had plummeted from heaven into hell, is prone on the fiery lake. And, across several lines, the narrator compares Satan's enormous size with that of the Titans. So that kind of similes, extended similes are there. Later in book 1, as the fallen angels file from the burning lake, an epic catalogue is used to cite their names as false gods whose idols were worshipped in infidel cultures, particularly in Asia Minor. So both the similes and catalogues, when examined closely, provide insight into other but related aspects of style, such as the Latinate diction and periodic sentence structure, which when accommodated to blank words create a majestic rhythm, a sense of grandeur, and at times sublimity. If Milton conceived of his dramatic poem after the manner of Greek tragedy, the resemblance is clear-cut. The unities of time, place, and action are also observed. The poem begins at dawn and ends at noon on the same day. The single place for the action is the workhouse, where after the destruction of that place, a messenger gives an account of the catastrophe. So this is what happens. The action is shown culminating in heroism. So this particular poem combines features of classical tragedy and Christian drama of regeneration. When Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and after, another poem, Samson Agonistes, are juxtaposed in their probable order of composition. The threefold arrangement, which is a virtual triptych, depicts Old Testament types, Adam and Samson yielding to temptation, then undergoing regeneration. So that Christian theme is there. It was there in Milton's mind through his mature years. Christ's triumph over the temple, that is the New Testament antitype at the center. So when one considers the grand scale across which the action of Paradise Lost takes place, whether it's in hell, whether it's the chaos, whether it's in heaven or the cosmos or the earth, so it seems that the other works are limited, other both works, they seem limiting and limited in their outlook. When one recalls the grand events of Paradise Lost, as I said, that heaven to the creation, war in the heaven, and then the creation of earth, and when Adam and Eve are sent there. So nothing of this sort happens in Paradise Regained, which appears to be a kind of static in action. So when we think of the dramatic elements of Paradise Lost, for instance, the motives for action, or the suspense, the conflict, the excitement which it creates for the reader, and the encouragement for intellectual and psychological responses, nothing of this sort is found in Paradise Regained, in which rather you will find that the temple is doomed to failure from the start, because Christ does not heed the temptations at all, but rejects them outright. So there is no conflict, no internal conflict. Probably Milton is depending on the contrast between Christ's wholesale dismissal of the temptation and the more engaged response by the reader, who is perhaps allured by the attractiveness of earthly glory. So, in his exercise of perfect obedience and of virtues such as faith, patience, and fortitude, Christ is one exemplar after whom we model our own conduct. This is the Christian thought which has been propagated through this book, which is a great, grand epic following all the epic conventions, but at some places in a modified way. So while contributing to Milton's grand design, each book in the epic has distinctive features. For instance, the first book, it begins with an invocation to the muse. Then if we talk of other books like book 3, book 7 and 9, they have a similar kind of openings. So in all these 4 instances, the narrator invokes divine assistance or inspiration to begin or continue his epic poem. So the invocations enable the narrator periodically to characterize himself, to announce his aspirations, and to assess his progress in composing the epic. Thus, in the invocation of Book 1, the narrator pleads for inspiration comparable to what Moses experienced in his relationship with the Lord. You see that topography is mentioned, including Horeb and Sinai, the mountains respectively, where God announced his presence to Moses and gave him the commandments, and Siloah's brook, where Christ healed the blind man. So all these are, even the topography, the geography is mentioned. So by implication, the narrator is trying to interrelate Hebraic and Christian landscapes with the haunts of the classical muses. So Milton, with his vision, which is so illuminated, he hopes to describe events of biblical history. At the same time, he is trying to invite comparison with epic writers of classical antiquity. But his work, which treats the higher truth of biblical history and interpretation, will supersede theirs, even those classic masters. So, in 1667, John Milton published this epic poem, Paradise Lost. And this poem stands alongside other pillars of literature such as the Iliad and the Divine Comedy, and even seeks to surpass them all in prose, rhyme, and subject. Rather than attempting to explain the merely human aspects of hubris or conversation, Milton addresses the chief source of our fallen nature and seeks to justify the ways of God to man. This has been told explicitly in Book 1, particularly look at line 26. So, although this book is primarily read by students in classical literature courses, its influence is as deep as that of Shakespeare. Great writers and poets such as William Blake, a romantic poet, Samuel Coleridge, another romantic poet, Joan Keats, another romantic poet, Lord Tennyson, Victorian poet, all drew inspiration from his work. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, if you have read it. The epigraph of that novel is taken from a passage of Paradise Lost, where the relationship between the maker and creator is described. One author who has written a trilogy, Philip Pullman is his name, he has written a trilogy, His Dark Materials, this is the name of the trilogy, and he draws heavily from Milton's work. And when we look at the image of angels and devils, so they form the basis of many Christian novels. There is one novel, Piercing the Darkness. So it has used those kind of images. And there are many more. So concisely we may say that Paradise Lost remains one of the exalted epics of English literature, just alongside the epics of Greek and Roman masters in Western literature. And it keeps inspiring generations of writers. And it keeps being taught in most universities globally, including your own course. Thank you so much.